Have you been keeping up with the mayoral race for New York City? I have, and I have some thoughts. During last week's debate, rent prices and rent control were hot topics. Let's listen to a few clips.
And for the record, what is your monthly rent or mortgage, Mr. Sliwa?
About $3,900. It's not subsidized, as all.
Mr. Mamdani, what is your monthly rent or mortgage?
$2,300.
Mr. Cuomo.
He has a rent-stabilized apartment that a poor person is supposed to have. Mine is about $7,800.
Funny for Cuomo to be criticizing Mamdani for living in a rent-stabilized unit because, as New York governor, he signed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act into law on June 14th of 2019. Prior to this law, landlords could remove units from stabilization and increase prices if tenants had an income of above $200,000 a year for 2 consecutive years, or if the monthly rent exceeded a certain amount, which at that time was $2,775, meaning a rent-stabilized apartment could no longer be moved to the free market if the rent reaches that amount. The law brought significant changes to the state's landlord-tenant laws, and they're considered to be some of the strongest tenant protections in New York history. Even then, based on current disclosures, Mamdani still would not have met the requirement to have his rent destabilized. Honestly, I really wish Mamdani and his team had more carefully crafted responses on rent control because he answered poorly. Truthfully, neither candidate has what I would consider an execution-ready plan for fixing rent price issues. As always, both candidates' plans have pros and cons. I don't live in New York City, and I don't plan to, so I have no skin in this game, but I do like doing the math. So let's dive into what it looks like to be a median income earner in New York City versus being Cuomo or being Mamdani, and allow the information to influence which candidate's plan you prefer. Cuomo has an estimated net worth of $10 million and an estimated annual salary of $560,000 a year. Mamdani has an estimated net worth of $200,000 and an estimated annual salary of $142,000 a year. These numbers come from candidate disclosures, so there are a few caveats. First is that cash accounts don't have to be disclosed, so candidates may have more than what they are required to report. And the second is that since the disclosures, Mamdani's gotten married, which could have impacted his net worth depending on prenups, etc. It's hard to find any info on his new wife's net worth, but the estimate I was able to find is between $200,000 and $400,000. Looking at what info is out there, I would place Cuomo's net worth closer to $15 million and Mamdani's closer to $800,000. Also, before anyone mentions his wealthy parents, and because Cuomo seems to use Mamdani's family as a constant sticking point.
Sons of millionaires need subsidized housing.
I'm only a few years older than Mamdani, and I don't know about you, but I don't get money from my parents, and they're at least more wealthy than I am. His parents' wealth may help him in the distant future, but it isn't a factor now, and even then, their net worth is an estimated $5 million, which still pales in comparison to Cuomo's own wealth. At the end of the day, we all know politics is pay to play, so none of these people represent average Americans, but one of these candidates is a hell of a lot closer than the other. That said, let's peek at average folks in New York City. The median income in New York City is $79,713 per year, while someone with a full-time minimum wage job of $16.50 an hour would make $34,320 a year. According to Zillow Market Trends, the average price of an apartment in New York City is $3,916 a month, with a studio averaging $3,394 and a 3-bedroom averaging $4,752. It's a standard rule that in order to afford living, housing should be no more than 30% of your gross income. That's your income before any deductions. A minimum wage worker working 40 hours a week all year grosses $2,860 per month. It's clear a full-time minimum wage worker cannot afford average rent for a studio apartment in New York City. 2 minimum wage workers living together gross $5,720 a month. They can now theoretically afford a studio apartment, but that would be 60% of their income before taxes, etc. No one would rent to them at that level, and even if they did, they would struggle to pay basic bills. Now let's look at the median income person in New York City. They make $79,713 a year. That means they gross $6,643 a month. An average studio apartment would be 51% of their gross income, meaning they still cannot afford the average studio apartment while still having enough money for basic needs like utilities and groceries. So, what would someone have to make to meet that 30% threshold to make a studio apartment in New York City technically affordable? That number is $136,000 in gross income. Putting net worth aside, let's take a look at what Cuomo and Mamdani are spending on their respective rents if the only money they took in was from their working income and pensions. Cuomo makes an estimated $560,000 a year and pays a self-reported $7,800 a month for a two-bedroom. That is 16.7% of his gross income. Mamdani makes an estimated $142,000 a year and pays a self-reported $2,300 a month for a one-bedroom in a rent-controlled apartment. That's 19.4% of his gross income. So, while Cuomo sits pretty, spending about 17% of his basic income in pensions, he wants to criticize Mamdani for living in a rent-controlled unit that is meant for a poor person. Even with rent control, Mamdani is still paying a higher percent of his income on rent. Let's check Mamdani again against the average one-bedroom apartment cost and see where he lands. The average one-bedroom in New York City is $3,821 a month, which would be 32.3% of his gross income, meaning he would be above the threshold of affordability. So let's say he chooses a studio instead. That would be 28.7% of his gross income, making him just able to afford it and still have enough to cover basic life expenses. This shows you it's really easy to criticize people for utilizing rent control, which has no income limit, as we mentioned previously, while hiding the fact that income-stabilized housing can require the tenants make 3 times the monthly rent in gross income. This is to ensure people don't rent housing that puts them over 33.3% of their gross income. This helps reduce evictions and other issues that can arise from people who are living outside of their means. So now that we know the 3 times rule, let's do a little more math. When the 3 times rule is enforced, the median New York City resident can afford a maximum rent of $2,214 a month. A minimum wage worker alone can afford $953 a month, and 2 minimum wage workers sharing space can afford $1,907 a month, all significantly below average New York City rent prices. Cuomo can afford rent of $15,556 a month, and Mamdani can afford $3,945 a month, which is just above the average one-bedroom cost. So if you believe that Mamdani should not live in a rent control unit, you believe that he should be absolutely maxing out what is affordable. And you, like Cuomo, would be totally missing the point that most people cannot afford current New York City rent prices.
If you think that the problem in this city is that my rent is too low, vote for him. If you know the problem in this city is that your rent is too high, vote for me.
So I have to agree with Mamdani on this one. He and people like him, people paying less than 30% of their gross income on rent in rent-controlled spaces, are not the right problem to focus on. The much greater issue is the median income versus the average rent price. When your median income worker can't afford your average studio apartment rent price because it would be over 50% of their income, your economy needs some serious scrutiny. So now you have the math. It's up to you to decide who has the better plan and who's more likely to follow through on it. With logic and reason for all,